This is the Extensionists, Conversations with Great Thinkers in Agriculture. I'm Toban Dyck.
And I'm Jay Whetter. Hey, Toban.
Hey, Jay.
I got a story about trees. When I was a kid, I decided that we needed to build this large fort in our pasture. And I was 14 or so, I'm guessing. My brother, John, was 12, and his friend, Jake, was with us. And we went, and I'd done a lot of post-hole digging with my father. At least he taught me how to do it. And we had like a manual. Like, it wasn't an auger, it was actual shovel.
Okay.
So I went out into this little grove of aspen down in one of the little ravines that led to our little lake called Chain Lakes. And anyway, we dug 4 post holes, and then we brought these old hydro poles from the back storage area and kind of lifted them up and dropped them in these holes. So we had these 4 big hydro poles, and then we built a 3.5-story fort. And I would climb to the top, and then we had this little platform, almost like a little diving board, and right there were some poplar trees.
Mm-hmm.
And I would climb off this little ledge onto the top of the tree, and there was a little fork of the tree, and I would just sit there. And to this day, I remember that feeling of being kind of at the top of an aspen tree, just kind of like swaying in the breeze.
That's cool.
And when I think of trees, I like trees. I don't know whether you would say I'm a tree hugger, but let's just say I like trees.
Have you hugged one? You invited the question. I'm not going to. So.
I don't think I have hugged a tree, but maybe I should. Next time I see one, I'll hug one. You have a favorite tree?
I do. So there's couple stories. One is I think it was like 2009. My wife and I went for a road trip on a car that should never have taken us on a road trip. We were young and had no money and all that kind of stuff. So we drove through Northern California. So we drove through the redwood forest, and I didn't know what we were about to drive through when we did it. Yeah. But that was such a magical experience, driving through like a little Jetta TDI, happening upon redwood trees. Have you ever been?
Yeah. Well, I've been not to California, but I've been to the Cathedral Grove on Vancouver Island.
Right. So just
the
these
Douglas
hundreds of meters high, and just straight and just massive. And I'll never forget that. I wanted to go back ever since, just kind of hate to use it, but the majesty of it. And so so there's that as a favorite tree story. But the other one is in our bush, just a few hundred meters from us right now. There's a massive tree along a trail that I carved in our backyard, and it's a big, massive oak.
Okay,
huge oak. It's the biggest tree in our forest. And is
it a bur oak?
It's a good question. So my nieces and nephews, which are the nibblings, my nibblings called him. His name is P.D. Biggins.
The oak tree is P.D. Biggins.
The oak tree,
and he's also a him.
He is like the lord. He's like the lord of the
Okay, I like
forest.
That. Yeah.
So
have you hugged P.D. Biggins?
I may have. We acknowledge P.D. Biggins every time we go on the walk. We put our hands on P.D. Biggins. He's
right on.
Special.
I like that. Well, we're going to talk about trees with David Sauchyn, our next guest, which is why we're rambling on about trees. So let's get on with it.
Let's do it.
To Dave.
But before we start today's interview, we want to thank our episode sponsor, Sask Oilseeds. Sask Oilseeds On-Farm Research Trials program aims to address farmer challenges by focusing on field-scale research, delivering valuable insights and solutions directly to canola farmers.
The program started in 2023 with 1 protocol on 10 sites and grew to 4 protocols and 23 sites in 2024.
There are 7 protocols available for the 2025 growing season. Saskatchewan farmers interested in becoming a cooperator are invited to contact Sask Oilseeds at 306-975-0262
or visit saskcanola.com for more information.
My name's Jay Whetter. This is Toban. And our guest today is David Sauchyn. And David is the director of the Prairie Adaptation Research Collaborative, is what I have written down, which PARC for short. And he's also a professor of geography and environmental studies at the University of Regina. And Dave joins us from Regina. Welcome.
Hi, guys.
Hi. You presumably know Jay a little bit. I've never met you before, so it's a pleasure.
Likewise.
Yeah, Dave, I've talked to you a couple times on the phone. We've emailed back and forth. And you may remember I was in your lab there in Regina with a farm writers group 2 or 3 years ago. And we talked about the Palliser exploration and the Palliser's Triangle and how the weather today is, I mean, there has been times anyway where the weather has been almost that bad, maybe as bad. So we'll get to that eventually. And then we also talked about trees, which I definitely want to talk to you about some of that tree ring research and how you use those to talk about climate, the history of climate over the last few hundreds of years anyway on the prairies.
You bet. Just fire away.
I think we should start off with a quick discussion about the Edmonton Oilers because so our colleague Ashley, who talks to you ahead of the interviews, she gave us some really interesting notes, and one of them was that it says you said to her that you're an Oilers fan. You're from Edmonton originally. You watch the Oilers objectively as a scientist. Do you recall saying something so strange?
Yeah, I might have said that. And by the way, I'm kind of dozy today because the game last night went to a shootout.
It did.
And they lost, so I couldn't sleep properly.
Wow, so you are an intense fan.
Oh, big time. Come on, I was born and raised. I played minor hockey in Edmonton, so.
And but you're not answering my question. so obviously, you're not as reserved or as scientific as you wish you were, because if you couldn't sleep after a game, obviously you're a little bit more.
Yeah, you're bringing emotion into it. Yeah. You're emoting over the Oilers.
So you wish you could watch as a scientist, but you haven't got
exactly.
there yet.
Yeah, that's my aspiration, to watch an Oilers game without getting emotionally involved. But I've just suffered. It's been too painful. And, if you look at it objectively, if you are a big fan of a team over the long term, they're going to lose half the time. That's the probability, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
So half the time you're going to be disappointed.
Yeah. Well, there you go. So as an Oilers fan, it's still painful to be an Oilers fan.
Yeah.
And the Oilers have won 5 cups. And I'm a Jets fan.
Boy.
They haven't won any cups. Yeah.
I mean, Jets are having a great year, but I mean,
are.
it's going to be a bit of a roller coaster with the Oilers. I mean, I know for sure, but the last 2 seasons, maybe 3, you could probably correct me, they've started really poorly. Like they've had a poor showing at the beginning of the season, and both seasons are like this season's they're now they're number 3 or 4 in the league.
Well, interesting. The Jets are 1, Oilers are 3rd, and Washington is in between. So they're both very good teams.
Washington,
this year.
they're both very good teams. But yeah, I mean, it's always that kind of slow start and then that build up, and they just work at it. The Oilers do throughout the season. And I have in my notes, Toban, you can ask him if he thinks McDavid deserves to win a cup. So I'm going to ask you if you think
not based on last night.
Oh no!
They had a 2-on-1 in overtime, and he lost the puck. It rolled off his stick.
Oh
yeah. I'm sure he deserves a cup. Why not? We all deserve a cup.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Jets deserve a cup more than the Oilers.
Wait a minute.
It's almost going to hang up.
This is going to a bad place, this conversation.
this interview's over.
See you guys.
Okay. Well, let's switch gears. So let's stay in Edmonton. But I want to see if you're a scientist in climate and environment and other things. But as you one of the things in the notes was that you switched high schools to a new high school, and you didn't have any friends, and you spent a lot of time by the river. So I'm wondering, was that a formative moment for you, career-wise? Like, was that where you got a passion for scientific vigor?
Well, first of all, as if the Oilers weren't enough of a sob story, you had to bring up high school. I wouldn't say it was a formative moment because my dad was, even though we grew up in suburban Edmonton, he was a fanatical hunter and fisherman. So we spent a lot of weekends and out in the foothills and out on the Aspen Parkland hunting and fishing. So it just seemed natural that in high school, when I didn't know anybody, I preferred to go down by the river and light a fire and watch the river go by. Yeah. I mean, I still had friends. They're in a different school.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, of course. You had a lot of friends, but you had to move schools, and you didn't have all those same friends
Yeah.
again. Yeah,
Something like that.
But you are a person who seems to be comfortable being alone in the woods. And I'm jumping ahead a number of years to your time in the cabin in the Rocky Mountains while you were at the University of Colorado. How did that come about?
Yeah.
Yeah, that came about because after I completed my undergraduate degree in Edmonton, I got the best job on earth, which was delivering mail, because I like to walk and I walk quickly and got paid for it. But I found that intellectually it wasn't that challenging, and my mind started going places that bothered me. So I thought I had too much time on the job to think.
You were going to go post.
Yeah, no, well, not quite that bad, but I thought I'd go back to university, and I ran into one of my professors, and I asked for his advice on where I should apply, and he goes, "Well, what do you like to do in your spare time?" And I said, "Well, I like to hike, I like to ski, apply to Colorado." Okay, and I did, got accepted. And when I got there, they said, the university has a group of log cabins up in the mountains that they inherited, and we'd like some students to occupy them so they're not vacant. And they charged me $50 a month, but they also gave me $400 a month to live there, which was back then was good cash. And apparently, most of the students turned them down because they didn't want to be living in a log cabin up in the mountains, no plumbing, no heat, and 40 kilometers to class. You had to drive 40 kilometers through the mountains. It was paradise. It was just paradise, absolutely.
These cabins were completely off grid. They were like
it was actually the university had created a research station, so this was a place where people could go in summer to do field research, but they wanted a few students to live there year round, and so there were some facilities, but my cabin was no, it had a light, it had electricity, but it had no plumbing.
Okay.
And well, I
heat.
had a log stove, so I had to
Right.
chop wood. Wasn't a big.
What was the field research? What were you doing?
My research in Colorado was on natural hazards because shortly before I moved to Colorado, the state government had passed legislation that required all the states in the mountains to produce a map of natural hazards. They had a problem where people from the flatlands, people from Oklahoma and Kansas and Texas would come to Colorado in summer and fall in love with it, and they'd buy some property. They'd come back the next year and it'd be gone. Well, the buildings would be gone because they didn't recognize they had bought property on an avalanche path or on a landslide. So they needed a bunch of students in the earth sciences to spend 2 summers hiking and mapping.
And mapping hazards.
I got paid well to hike every day for 2 summers throughout the.
So what's better, being a postman or that job?
Well, hiking in suburban Edmonton or through the Colorado Rockies, I have to give the edge to the Colorado Rockies.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. So we're setting the foundation for Dave, the scientist, the environmental scientist. What took you to Regina? And then we'll get into some of the work, but we're just doing the background for now.
I went to Regina via Waterloo, Ontario, because after I did my master's thesis research in Colorado and overstayed my welcome, I lived illegally for a few months because I just couldn't bear the fact of vacating that log cabin. But I did, my visa expired. Fortunately, I'd met a young woman that summer in June, and we got married in December. We moved to Canada. Well, I dragged her to Canada.
Right. She's from Colorado or somewhere
Nebraska,
in the States.
but doing her
Nebraska.
thesis research in Colorado. I should have got her permission to say these things. But yeah, anyway, that's all I'll say about that. So moved back to Canada, and I still had the itch to do mountain research. And I discovered that at the University of Waterloo, there was a professor who was from Calgary originally. He was from Calgary, and he did his field research in the Rocky Mountains in Alberta. So I applied for him and said, would you consider taking another student? And he said, well, let's talk about it in the Rocky Mountains. So we met in the backcountry in Kananaskis and camped for a few days and talked about what I would do if I was a PhD student. Went to Waterloo, Ontario, did that. And of course, then when you have maximized your university education, you have to go looking for a job. And the job became available in Regina.
Tell me about the Prairie Adaptation Research Collaborative. When did that start, and were you the person who started it?
No, I'm emphatic because people keep insisting. Oh, it's Dave's thing. No, it's not. I didn't create it.
Oh, what is it?
It was created by the federal government. In the late 1990s, the federal government decided that there should be somewhere in Canada a climate change science and adaptation research center, that climate change was becoming a policy and issue, and that they needed scientists who would produce the science necessary to make policy decisions. And so they said, okay, we'll start with a research center based on the prairies, because they saw that climate change could potentially have serious impacts for the prairie provinces. And they chose Regina, and the reason they gave that, at the time, there was an organization called the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, PFRA. You may have heard of PFRA. I can't believe people these days don't know of PFRA. It was a phenomenal federal government organization. It was created.
I associate it with planting trees.
The shelter belt. Yeah, the shelter belt at Indian Head, for sure. They gave away millions of seedlings, and so a lot of the shelter belts on the prairies contained have trees that were seedlings at the Indian Head tree nursery. But PFRA was created in response to the drought of the 1930s. And it was created to rehabilitate the farm economy. And it was very successful. And such that by the 1990s and 2000s, it was still around. Their mandate had changed somewhat, but they were still they were still encouraging the farm community to practice soil and water conservation and to deal with climate change. And so it was natural that PARC should work closely with PFRA, at least in our first decade, because the federal government, the Harper administration, decided that they would eliminate PFRA. They put PARC in Regina. It was launched in 2000, and the board, the director, contacted me and said, we need a scientist. We have no staff yet. We need a scientist who will develop a research program for PARC. Would you be willing to move your office a couple buildings away to the PARC facility? And that was 2000.
Wow. Can you tell me about the Palliser's Triangle? Kind of recreate what you were trying to tell us as farm journalists when we were there a few years ago at your office. And if I recall, but you're going to have to set me straight, that the climate at the time of Pallis's triangle or the Whetter. You can tell me whether I'm saying it right. But when Palliser came out and did his explorations and assessed that Pallis's triangle was going to be useless for agriculture, maybe those aren't his words, but I think you said that we've had similar weather patterns or climate patterns since then that may actually have been worse, but because we've adapted or learned to adapt, that the actual effect on potential farm productivity is less. I know there wasn't per se farming at the time of Palliser's exploration, but like farming in the way we know it anyway. But can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, certainly. Well, like you said, we've had some years or 2 consecutive years that have been extremely dry and probably nearly as bad as it gets. What's unique about the Palliser drought of the 1840s to 1870s is it was a couple decades, almost 3 decades, in which most of the years were dry. So it was the duration of that drought which was unusual, and we've come close. I mean, the 30s were dry, the 80s were dry, but not quite as dry and prolonged as that drought of the mid-19th century. And what Palliser said was there would be a large region that would be forever comparatively useless. So he was talking about the driest part of the Canadian Prairies, southwestern Saskatchewan, southeastern Alberta. He also referred to a fertile belt further to the north, the black soil zone, the moist margin of the prairie and the Aspen parkland. He acknowledged that there was potential, but he advised the government to stay away from southwestern Saskatchewan and southeastern Alberta, which we refer to as now Palliser's Triangle.
Is there a message today in any of the experiences that from Palliser or in the 30s or the 80s that we could use to help with adaptation?
Well, I mentioned the extent to which PFRA facilitated adaptation. When you think of dugouts and shelter belts and row cropping and irrigation, not so much irrigation because it was around before the 30s, but a lot of the farming practices that we associate with soil and water conservation were facilitated by PFRA. And in fact, we wouldn't have an ag industry that's commercially successful if it wasn't for a lot of adaptation. When you think about it, we practice agriculture in a pretty harsh climate. It's cold, it's dry, and short growing season. And there aren't too many places on earth where they practice agriculture commercially, industrially, that have a climate as harsh as ours. And that's entirely enabled by a whole lot of adaptation, including the breeding of crops that can thrive in this climate, and a lot of farming practices which continue to evolve. And so there's a pretty strong argument to say that amongst the most adaptable people in Canada, and if not the world, are those who farm in a harsh climate like ours. And they adapt on it from year to year, obviously, because it's an annual rotation. So there's an opportunity to adjust farming practices on an annual basis.
Is there a sense of kind of what the next big adaptation is for ag?
Well, there was a major adaptation 1980s or so, and that's minimum till or zero till. They discovered that summer fallow was not a good idea. Interesting, I read recently that there were actually ag scientists way back in the 20s saying, well, this was a mistake. Sorry, we shouldn't have recommended this, but it took 50, 60 years for the entire community to recognize that summer fallow was not a bad idea. So not a good idea, it was a bad idea. And at the time in the 80s, the reason that minimum till was introduced was to control soil erosion. But it turns out to be a good adaptation to climate change, because you're also improving the infiltration of soil water. You're also keeping the temperature of the soil lower. So there's a lot of research, and producers will tell you that this fairly dramatic change in farming practices over the last few decades is good adaptation and preparation for the kinds of climate changes that are occurring now and that we expect in the future.
Can you quantify what kind of climate changes are occurring now?
Yep, that's what we do. I mean, I'm sitting in my office, and outside here I got a team of fantastic scientists who do a lot of modeling and measurement and analysis. We analyze huge sets of data, and we have a lab down the hall that Jay has seen with thousands of pieces of old wood, and we have millions of measurements of tree growth, which is a proxy for soil moisture. I mean, trees need water, so we know how much water was in the soil for the last 1,000 years. So just outside my office here, we have a box, which is a storage device, and it stores up to 96 terabytes of data because we have a whole lot of measurements and observations and modeling of climate and soil and soil and so on. But it's just numbers, unless there's some kind of context, unless there's a question, unless there's a hypothesis, unless there's some kind of application. It's just a big mess of numbers. So we do a lot of work for the ag sector, for producer groups, and for banks that loan money to the farmers, and for government. And in every case, they got questions, and so we can produce data and facts to address those questions. And the big question is, well, how do you know the climate's changing? And what's really ironic and unusual about our work is that we work with people who a large segment of our audience don't believe in climate change. And yet we work with them, and they're willing to work with us. They're willing to fund our work, even though they don't believe in climate change.
Mm-hmm.
But Dave, I want to get to that.
Yeah,
because this is the key. But
Yeah.
I want to come back to my question. So you've got all this data. So what is happening on the prairie? So we have more frost-free days. Our summers are hotter. Our winters are wetter. So what?
Our summers are not hotter.
Okay, so this is what I want you to. How has the climate changed? Say in the time that you've been with PARC, like has there been, or maybe I don't know what time horizon would be right, but I mean, what is happening out there?
The time horizon we use is the length of the weather record, which is back to the 1880s. So when we use weather data, we go back to the 1880s. When we use tree data, we go back to the year 542, 1,500 years ago. When we talk about the climate of the future, we go out to the end of the century. That's the kind of time horizon.
Okay. So what's changing?
It's not getting hotter, and that's a big misconception. And we deal with a lot of misconceptions because most people, not necessarily farmers, but even farmers, they get their information from the internet, right? That's the source of knowledge these days, is the internet. And there's just a whole lot of misinformation. And even if the information is correct, it's not about the Canadian prairies, right? It might be, but typically we're told how the climate of the world is changing. We're told repeatedly that the climate of the whole world has warmed by about 1 degree in the last 100 years. Okay, well, what does that mean? I mean, have you noticed? Have you noticed that the world is warming?
I wouldn't have the tools. I wouldn't.
Well,
know.
Nobody does. I mean, if you grab your phone to the weather app and find the temperature of the whole world. It's not there. It's the Earth is not an option on your phone. And what does the average mean? The average doesn't exist. It's a statistical concept, right? So, we're told the whole world is warmed by 1 degree, and so people think, well, it's warming everywhere and it's warming all the time. No, that's not. Some places are warming much faster than others. The Canadian Arctic is warming way faster than the rest of the world. And it's not warming all the time. Some years are warmer than others. And when you look at the Canadian Prairies, if you look at the weather record, the highest temperature we've ever had was in 1936 at Mydale, Saskatchewan. It was 114 degrees.
Wow.
Yeah, it's never been warmer. Now our summers are getting longer, and there's more heat. There are more warm days, but we don't necessarily get more days above 40 than we used to. Every few years we get 41 degrees. So it's not getting hotter. It's getting warmer, but mostly it's getting much less cold. That's where we see
the lows are
exactly
higher, but the highs aren't necessarily higher.
The minimum temperatures are rising faster than the maximum temperatures.
And the summers are getting longer, I heard you say. So is that the same as frost-free days, or how do you define that?
Yeah, we define that in terms of days above 0, or days above 10, or days above 20, and growing degree days. That's a real handy index that is used a lot in the ag sector. The growing degree days, how much heat is available during the growing season, and that's going up. But the strongest indicator of a warming climate in our part of the world is that winter is much less colder than it used to be.
So that is a fact.
People like to whine and complain about our winters. Shut up. and I feel like an old timer, but I was just, and if you don't believe me, if you just go to the Environment Canada website and just download the weather record for any location on the prairies, and then look at the minimum temperatures, which almost every day, the minimum temperature is right around sunrise. Right, so when you're scraping the frost off your truck, that's usually the lowest temperature, and it's gone up quite a bit.
All right, and so the last thing I want to touch on is moisture. Any noticeable changes in moisture patterns, rainfall patterns, precipitation patterns?
Yeah, and that's where we spend most of our effort in terms of research, because it's so extremely variable from day to day, month to month, season to season, year to year. We have amongst the most variable hydroclimate. We say hydroclimate, right? Those climate variables that involve water. The two most variable hydroclimates on Earth are the middle of Eurasia, Kazakhstan, Siberia, Western China, and the Canadian Prairies. And what we have in common is you can't get any further from the ocean than the middle of North America and the middle of Eurasia.
Siberia,
yeah. We have Western Kazakhstan. We had a delegation from Western Kazakhstan, and they felt at home in Saskatchewan.
Yeah,
that's really interesting.
And we know we're a highly variable hydroclimate. Is the variability changing, or is there anything of note that farmers should recognize as maybe different from when they were first starting as farmers? Is there any noticeable change for them?
When we look at the future, and we have no rainfall data for the future or tree rings, so we have to use these models that simulate the climate of the world. And when you look at the output of all of these models, a pretty consistent scenario, or projection we call it, is an increase in the range between the driest and wettest years. So the volatility of our climate is increasing. We say that in a warmer climate, the hydrological cycle is amplified. And this makes sense in terms of just basic geophysics, because most of our water comes from the Pacific Ocean. Our weather comes from the west, and the Pacific Ocean is to the west of us. And so these storms form over the ocean, and eventually they reach us. Well, the oceans are heating up, and as they warm up, they're producing more water vapor, and eventually that vapor has to form rain and snow and precipitate. So there's a pretty good body of science that says if you warm up the world, rain should be heavier. And it seems to be happening. So when we get rain, it seems to be more intense. And that's something we can expect. But if we don't get rain, let's say the storms go someplace else and we have a warmer summer, then you can expect it also to be drier. So it's like the extremes are the wetter places and wetter years are wetter, and the drier places and drier years are drier. The problem is it's just so extremely variable, it's hard to see.
Yeah. What are some of the, you've spoken, you said it's in the notes here too, you've spoken to farmers in areas where they don't believe in climate change and you're exposed to them a lot. I am a farmer from southern Manitoba. I'm exposed to a lot of farmers who don't believe in climate change as well. What are some messages and some techniques that have really stuck, or are really kind of, you've been able to kind of get in a little bit with your messaging?
Yeah, apparently I got in because I've been asked to give hundreds of talks to farm groups and rural audiences, and I really enjoy it. My academic colleagues say, how can you talk to people who don't believe in climate change? Well, I just imagine I'm talking to my aunts and uncles and cousins because on my mother's side, my mother was raised on the farm, and I spent summers on that farm, and I still have a few aunts and uncles, mostly cousins in Alberta. One cousin in Saskatchewan, but for the most part in Alberta. And I just imagine I'm talking to them. And in fact, a couple times I've been asked to speak in Alberta, and a cousin and an aunt showed up. They were in the audience. So, but the other thing is, I enjoy talking to people who are exposed to the weather and climate. I have so many friends and colleagues and people in the city who tell me about climate change, but they get the information from the internet. They're sitting behind a computer. Right. I'd rather talk to people who I really enjoy talking to Indigenous knowledge keepers and elders and people in the farm community because they're out there in the weather and climate.
Yeah.
And how do you then take some skepticism about climate change and then turn the conversation to, to a weather and I don't know whether you feel like you need to change the mind, but change the mindset. Yeah, because you ultimately you want, but you still need to talk about how to adapt. I think we need to get the prairies to tools to adapt to the changing climate. So what is the point of going to these hundreds of meetings with farmers who may not believe in climate change, but you still have a really important message to them? So how do you get that message?
I'm gonna tack on to one thing before you answer that. And then as you think about that, has there been a moment when you've been at an event and someone's come to you and just kind of you've reached them, like you've kind of like, I know you're not intending to change minds, you're talking, you're listening, but has there been kind of some of those moments where it's like, I see this now?
It happens.
Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, no,
it
those
happens
are related.
all the time.
Do both.
In fact, I've got somewhere on my desk here, I just printed off an email from a farm group in Saskatchewan thanking us for our work. And if you're going to find skeptics anywhere on earth, it's going to be South Texas or southwestern Saskatchewan. So they even admitted that their board of directors said they admitted most of them, or some of them don't believe in climate change, but they really appreciate our work. So that's very gratifying. It's much more gratifying than another refereed journal article. And also, it's when they explain to me why they're skeptical. It makes sense. After I spoke to a group of producers in Tabor, Alberta, this one guy came up to me. He was a manager of an irrigation district. And he said, Dave, nice talk, but I'll believe in climate change when we get weather I don't expect. And I said, can I quote you? And I've quoted him hundreds of times because he just defined climate change. If you get weather you don't expect, then it's outside the realm of your climate, and the climate has changed. Maybe not once, but if you get it a bunch of times, it's... And so I realized, well, climate I don't expect. Well, what can you expect on the Canadian prairies? Anything.
Yeah.
Great question. Anything
could happen. Yeah.
Especially in the spring.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's
So
actually a really interesting point.
It's subtle. Yeah. Then the change is subtle and people don't notice it. Is that
exactly
what the message there is?
Yeah, it's subtle. It's so far it's gradual. I mean, there could be tipping points or abrupt climate change, but so far it's a relatively gradual change against a backdrop of huge variability from year to year, season to season. The way scientists describe it is the signal versus the noise. So if the signal is climate change, it's hard to see against a background of a huge amount of noise, which is the natural variability. Yeah.
Do you think we're... Yeah. I do want to, just to build on that question Toban had about like getting through to people and how do you convey a message of adaptation. So I think the climate change debate, is it real, is it not, is that maybe it's not even, doesn't even matter. What we need to talk about is what's happening on your farm, what's affecting your ability to produce a crop, and how do we improve the practice to adapt to a longer season, warmer summer nights, maybe milder winters that may affect insects or pathogens. I don't know. So how do you take the skepticism and convert it into some helpful action on the farm?
You're exactly right. It's hardly even necessary to talk about global warming. In fact, I try to avoid using that terminology. And there are people, most producers are curious people, and their industry is science-based, so they read the science and online when they have time. And so they'll ask me questions about global warming and the causes and so on. And I'm always reluctant to go there because we're really here to talk about not the causes of a rise in temperature of the whole world, but how is your operation, how is your community affected by weather and climate, and how do we see that changing into the near future, and what are you going to do about it? So that's the crux of the discussion. And I also appreciate the fact that producers are very aware of the fluctuation in soil moisture from season to season and year to year. Mm-hmm. And it's so large that it's difficult to see that gradual, we call it incremental change, as resulting from a warmer climate. And so to me, it makes perfect sense. I have colleagues in the social sciences and social psychology and psychology who try to explain the attitude of producers in terms of who they are, how they behave, and what they think. But I think there's a much simpler explanation. They're just exposed to a whole lot of variability that obscures the gradual changes. And when you say, well, how do you get through to them? I usually start with the tree rings.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great segue.
All right. What do you do with the tree
because,
rings?
And for various reasons. I mean, one reason is most of the trees are on farmland, ranch land, actually. So we have to work with producers to access the trees. And they're incredibly cooperative. Like they say, the cattle don't eat the trees, they eat the grass. So as long as you don't set the grass on fire, you can take those trees down. Well, not take them down, but sample them. So we have a lot of interaction with producers just in the course of our fieldwork to gain access to old trees. But also, they understand that trees are a plant and need moisture, and they understand that the tree ring story, the reconstruction of climate from tree rings, is real. it's a climate that actually occurred. And it's very, models, it's just make-believe. It's just made up. I mean, that's all we have for a future climate. But after all, the climate that the models produce is just hypothetical.
Sure. Yeah. Easy to dismiss anyway. Yeah.
When I think of a tree ring, Dave, I think of, a dark line. I don't know whether that's winter, and then a lighter colored space that varies. And then you get another black line or dark line. So what?
Walk us through that. Walk us through it. Oh, here we go. Nice. We get the visual.
So I want to know what is a tree ring and what does it tell us? Oh, here we go.
Nice.
My office is full of old wood. It smells good. And down the hall, we have thousands and thousands of pieces of old wood. It's the annual growth, and we have an ideal climate because we have a very sharp and short growing season. So there's a definite end to the growing season, to the growth of the trees. You can't do this kind of work in the tropics because the trees never stop growing, right? Although they try. But it works well here. And so if you look at a tree ring, it's actually got two parts. There's a light-colored part and a dark-colored part. The light color is the early growth. In the spring, where usually there's decent soil moisture. And then as the summer and growing season proceeds, the soil tends to dry out, but also it's cooling off. And so the tree growth slows and it produces a darker, denser ring. So we actually take 2 measurements per year of the early wood and the amount of late wood, and we take very precise measurements. So we have almost 4.8 million measurements of tree growth. And in a dry climate, it's a proxy for soil moisture because that's what limits tree growth. So, I mean, if you took wood from a cold place, so you get a temperature record. But in our part of the world, really, nearly everywhere, soil moisture is what limits growth. Yeah.
Okay. So the width of the ring.
This, what kind of messages are you getting?
How much more? Yeah. So we're learning how much moisture happened in a year based on how wide the light colored ring is. What else does it tell us? Does it tell us anything else useful? You said temperature in the north, but
well, it depends where you collect the wood. I mean, we've collected wood high up in the Rocky Mountains, and when you get to a certain elevation and the trees disappear because there's not enough heat. So those tree rings tell us how much heat was available each year. And that's why scientists who do this kind of work are able to determine that there's been a lot more heat in the world in the last few decades than prior millennia. It's some of the most convincing evidence that, yes, our climate is warming at an unusual rate. It's from tree rings collected at cold places. But we do most of our collecting up and down the foothills and the eastern slopes of the Rockies, across the southern part of the boreal forest, down into southwestern Manitoba, southeastern Saskatchewan, where there's oak trees, old oak trees. And we cross the border because the climate doesn't change at the international border. So we collect tree rings in Montana and North Dakota. And where it's dry. And so we know that what's driving tree growth is how much water was available each year.
What is it? Why oaks?
Oak because they get old, 3 to 400 years, some of the oak trees. And they also are quite sensitive to the availability of water, more so than other trees.
Did you ever test that old oak tree in Souris that just fell down? It was 600 years old or something like that?
No, we should.
It's gone.
I know. We have to check it out. Yeah.
Too bad. Well, if anyone tells us about old oak trees, mind you probably know where all the old oak trees are on the prairies.
No, not necessarily. No.
No? What's the oldest tree on the prairies?
Or oldest one.
The oldest tree in the prairie provinces would be in Alberta for sure.
In the mountains or out on the plains?
No, in the mountains. You get trees that are well over 1,000 years old. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow. That's
because in the mountains there's natural
amazing.
fire breaks, right?
Yeah.
And you won't find old trees elsewhere because there's nothing to stop the fire and kill the trees. But we keep looking. We keep looking for places where the fire hasn't been recently, and we find trees that are centuries old. But the really old ones, the ones that are exceeding 1,000 years, would be out west from here.
So have the trees ever told you something data-wise that other data wasn't able to show?
Yeah, and that's the big advantage the trees have is they're annual. The rings are annual, right? So we have annual, we have subannual, we have seasonal data from the tree rings. There are a lot of scientists who do what's called paleoclimate research. We look at the climate of the past, and they collect ice cores from ice sheets and glaciers, and a lot of the work is based on lake sediments because everything in a watershed eventually gets washed to the lowest elevation into a lake or a wetland. So a lot of these scientists have produced incredible reconstructions of the climate, including the prairies, based on cores taken from lakes. Only problem is you can't necessarily know the age of a layer of mud to within a year or to within a season. There's a few exceptions where in deep lakes the sediments laid down in layers, but on the prairies we have fairly shallow lakes, and the wind comes along and stirs up the mud, and so it's like the record is being averaged every time the sediments get stirred up and settle back down. You've destroyed the chronology, and so there's really good information of the climate of the last 10,000 years since the glacier left, but it tends to be relatively coarse compared to the tree rings, which are subannual. So that's a big advantage we have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where are you going?
I want to talk about extension.
Okay. I do want to. There's one topic I want to talk about before we close.
Okay.
Okay. But you go first.
Well, so Dave, you've got the evidence now, centuries old evidence now showing that, and I'm going to repeat what we already talked about, that winters are getting milder, summers are getting longer. The days, the highs may not be getting higher. We've had, like you said, the warmest day ever was 1936 at Mydale, Saskatchewan. But our overall temperatures are getting higher, maybe because the evenings or the nights are getting warmer. You've got the data. Your job isn't necessarily to extend that to farmers to suggest adaptation. Maybe you do some of that. But how do you partner then to help farm organizations, researchers, extension groups recognize the data and then try to think of ways that they can adapt? How do you take what you know and try to encourage adaptation at the farm level?
Well, first of all, we never tell farmers what to do. It's not our job, and we're not ag producers. We don't do agricultural research, but they ask for it. They ask us to supply them with information about how the climate is changing, and we can make recommendations, but not about specific best practices. But we can say, okay, there's pretty good scientific evidence that the dry years are getting drier and the wet years are getting wetter. So you want to farm such that you can take advantage of the excess water and that it's available in those dry years. So basically what you want to do is you want to manage the soil and the crops such that you're able to store water and take advantage of that stored water when you need it. Now, obviously, obvious adaptations include the storage of water in reservoirs and irrigation are the obvious ones. But a lot of that has been tapped out unless there's a there is the government of Saskatchewan and all three provinces have plans to expand irrigation, but you can't irrigate everywhere. So a more, I guess, universal approach is to farm such that the soil retains water. And I know that there is a certain segment of the farming population who thinks they have the answer. I'm not here to endorse what they do, because one thing I've discovered is that the farm population is incredibly diverse. Much more diverse than the people in my neighborhood in Regina, right? And so you can't generalize about. But I was told a long time ago, if you're going to give a talk to anybody with scientists, know your audience, know who you're talking to. It was actually a politician, quite a famous politician, who told me that. He said, Dave, scientists know what they want to say. They have no idea who they're talking to. He said, politicians don't speak until they know what the audience wants to hear. And so, there's a middle ground where you got to know who you're talking to, and you got to be. I'm always careful to advocate or suggest any particular farming practice is better than another, because it depends who I'm talking to. I like to get to know, even though I know they're producers, but the nature of what brought them together. Do they share a commodity, or do they share a location, or do they share a certain attitude towards crop production or grazing or whatever? And so I always go into a talk or a meeting with that kind of information, because I know that there is a constituency of farmers who think that we should farm to maintain soil health, and we should farm, or they should farm to maintain a cover for as many days as possible, and in other words, practice the principles of regenerative agriculture. And I'm careful not to use that terminology because it's somewhat controversial. Unless I'm speaking at a conference on regenerative agriculture, then it's safe to use that. I was asked to do that a couple of years ago. It was 2 years ago, last December. There was a Western Canada conference on soil health in Edmonton, and I was asked to give one of the keynote talks. And so I did a bit of research on regenerative agriculture, and some of the media coverage was saying it's all the rage. Really? Is it all the rage? But I was expecting a handful of farmers, and I got there, and there were 500 people in the room, and they were turning people away. So, there is some interest in in the principles of soil health, and I get asked quite often to speak to organizations that are quite supportive of these practices. And I go in there and I tell them, you seem to have a good idea, because according to the climate projections, you can expect more variability between the wettest and driest years, and you seem to have a means of protecting the soil, enhancing the soil, and getting it to store more water and carbon. And they like to hear that. And I come away thinking, whoa, this regenerative agriculture seems like a good idea, until I speak to another group of producers who take a different approach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Toban, what was your question?
Well, my question was, I was going to go a completely different.
Go for it.
You said something, we were talking about winter, and you told people to shut up about how our winters were so cold, which I really like, because my wife and I often talk this way as well, because even on the theme of adaptability, I'm looking at your screen right now. I can tell he's wearing a merino wool sweater, maybe even a smart wool sweater, or he's adapted to Canadian prairie winters, and it's just like it drives me nuts when people complain about winter, because we have, especially nowadays, we have access to so much great gear and clothing, and like there's no reason why we can't walk out in minus 40 with wind chill and be completely comfortable. Like the gear is there. So I and the amount of time you've spent in the wilderness and in the Rockies, and you're cross country skiing, I'm just wondering, are you like I have an old canvas outfitter's tent in the bush by our farm, and I like to go out there and build a fire in the wood stove and get it warm, and I love that kind of stuff, and we love cross country skiing as well. I was wondering, are you a bit of a gear junkie?
Yeah, you could probably say that. A tool junkie and a gear junkie. Yeah. But I mean, we're kindred spirits, because I love being outside in winter. Just love it.
Yeah. No, yeah.
Dave, I just want to, we have one last question, and then we have to wrap up, but I wanted to make sure we captured, whether you had a note down of something you really wanted to get across that you didn't get a chance to say.
Yeah. And I'll preface it by saying that some of the best questions I ever get are from ag producers. I gave a talk somewhere in central Alberta at a hockey rink. And I talked about the tree rings, of course, and this producer says, "Why do you keep collecting more wood? Don't you have enough?" Wow, what a good question. And I made up some, I don't know, silly answer about, in science, it's all about replication and so on. And then driving back from central Alberta back to Regina, the whole way I was scratching my head thinking, wow, what would be a better answer to that question? And it actually prompted a bunch of research, because we thought, we've got so much wood and so many tree rings, how can we take advantage of that? And we discovered that by having collected so much wood, which I do because I need to get outside and off campus for my sanity, but by collecting so much data and so much wood, we can answer questions that very few other labs can.
I think that's almost a metaphor for where
cool.
we're at with data. Sometimes I feel like, and research. And I don't want to suggest that we don't need more research, but I think sometimes we forget all the work that we have, or the data we have, or the wood that we have, and then we forget that we need to start talking about what this wood is telling us. So we've got the wood now. How do we talk? And which is what this podcast is all about. That's the extension part.
And it turns out, when I started collecting wood in the mid 1980s in the Cypress Hills, I didn't foresee that 40 years later, it would be of more applicable and of more value than ever, because the worst case scenario for the prairies moving forward is when a long drought will reoccur in a warmer climate. It's going to happen. It's going to be devastating, right? Well, what would that long drought look like? Well, we can go to the tree rings and we can tell governments and producer groups and so on what a long drought looked like, because it happened in decades prior to the settlement of the prairies.
When will we have another long drought? Like, is there any way to? It's impossible to predict. But a 30-year drought like that, 1840s, 1870s, like you said, would be devastating.
Plus, occurring in a climate that's warmer than back then.
Right.
We can't say, it's the best analogy is earthquakes, because a geologist can say, I know for sure there's going to be an earthquake right here, but they can't tell you when. We just have to prepare. We just have to be prepared.
Well, I'm going to go back to the outfitters, the gear thing. So, two things. What's your favorite piece of kit or gear for wilderness adventures? And two, when and what is your next adventure?
Oh boy, my favorite piece of gear. the pad, thermarest pad, because I love sleeping outside, but it's getting more difficult to sleep on the ground comfortably. So that's an essential piece of gear. In the next wilderness adventure, who knows? My wife and I are having a camping trailer built.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Like custom built.
Custom built, yeah. It's been 2 years. It'll probably be another year yet before it's done.
Like a teardrop style, or is it like?
Well, it's remember the bowler trailers? It's very small. Yeah.
What a fun project that must be to kind of conceive of this thing from a blank slate and build it out.
But we're anxious to. So we'll, I just love exploring the prairies. There's just people really don't appreciate this landscape to the extent that some of us do. Yeah.
Oh, well, I appreciate this. I appreciate your time.
Dave, this has been a pleasure.
Okay, guys.
Thank
Good
you
talking
so
to you.
much.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, likewise.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye, Dave.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you to our episode sponsor, Sask Oilseeds. Results from their 2024 on-farm research trials program are online at saskcanola.com.
In their second year, Sask Oilseeds' top-notch farming trials had a big expansion, a testament to the program's impactful contributions to the farming community.
And once again, thank you to our episode sponsor, Sask Oilseeds.
Are you curious about what Jay and I get up to behind the scenes at the Extensionists?
The Extensionist has a newsletter. We'd love you to subscribe. We give you exclusive content, some behind the scenes,
and important updates. You're never going to miss an episode again.
Please sign up at theextensionist.com.
Well, that was another great conversation. We've had so many. And I learned a lot about climate change on the prairies. So the summers are getting longer.
Mm-hmm.
The winters are getting milder.
Yeah.
The highs aren't necessarily getting higher because he said the highest ever temperature was in 1930s.
114.
Yeah, 114 Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
But the summer nights are getting warmer. And then rain or precipitation is just thoroughly unpredictable. I don't know whether that's new, but
I really like that. What was the one comment he said? The one farmer had told him, "I'll believe in climate change when he's surprised." Or what was the comment?
Yeah.
Which I think that's kind
of something unexpected, or
yeah. Which I think is an interesting one, right? Because I think a lot of farmers, a lot of people are just used to unpredictable weather.
Yeah, like these plow winds, which are very strange.
So how do you fit climate change into that narrative, right? It doesn't really fit properly because it's like, sure, but everything's in flux and kind of unforeseeable. How do you carve space for this thing that's climate change?
But at the same time, it is changing. And we need to think of ways to adapt to that.
Right. And so the trees is very interesting, right? Yeah. Like that's a very interesting model for visually representing climate change.
I saw your eyes light up like you had a story when you was talking about hockey. So and I know we didn't want to talk about hockey, obviously that's, but I did the whole time I was thinking about, do I come back to hockey? Because I really wanted to tell my story. So my story is incredibly, incredibly colorful. Okay.
Yeah. So I played minor hockey for a number of years. Yeah. I forget when I think I left minor hockey just before you're allowed to body check, whatever that is. And I think that age has changed.
Yeah, 12 or 14. It could have been either of those. Yeah.
Yeah. So a couple things. I was the only kid on my team that still wore the pants.
The Cooperalls?
Something like that. So the other kids had the shorts. Yeah. Like they look so cool. I just pants. And in my many years playing, I did not score one goal. Yeah. And I played forward. Yeah. I was like right wing. There was one game where the puck kind of trickled in front of the net. And I was like, this is my shot. Yeah. I'm going to score. All I had to do was nudge it.
And what happened?
What happened was I went in and I was in my memory anyway, I was gonna go in and I was gonna just like slap shot this thing in, right? Well, I miss the puck and I fling up and I lose my footing and I fall down and I slide into the net and the puck did not move at all. So there was my one option, my one chance. So that's the incredible hockey story.
Yeah. Well, I don't have really super incredible ones. I just will say that my very favorite year playing hockey was when I came back at age 15 and I was a goalie for a Deloraine Wascata team. And I still think about those guys. We had a really good group.
At 15, you said?
Yeah, at 15. Yeah.
Goalie.
Yeah. We didn't have a single practice before our first game. We lost 17-2. So that's like the Toban sliding into the net equivalent.
It's quite similar. It's quite similar.
Yeah, and my teammates were very supportive of me.
Well, that's
so
nice.
That was good. Yeah,
That's nice.
They helped me through. Anyway,
maybe I would have been able to score on you if you were net. I'm just saying. Maybe we should
tee that up. That's right.
But probably not.
Yeah. Anyway, we should wrap up.
We should.
We are the Extensionists.
You're Jay Whetter.
I'm Jay Whetter. You're Toban Dyck.
It's true.
Till next time. This has been a Burr Forest Group production. We also want to thank the people you don't see.
We're here. We're chatting away with our guests. But there's tons of people who work behind the scenes to make this podcast happen.
Ryan Sanchi is our director.
Ashley Robinson is the coordinator.
And Abby Wall is our producer and editor.